Before the flood became a story of destruction, it may have been remembered as a moment of farewell, not shouted, not announced, but pressed quietly into stone. The oldest tablets do not read like warnings. They do not beg. They do not explain. They speak as if the ending was already accepted, as if someone knew the world would change and chose not to stop it. Tonight, this is not a story about a flood. It is about a teacher who may have said goodbye before the waters rose, leaving behind words meant not to save the past, but to prepare those who came after. Night settles easily when the world grows quiet enough to listen. In that quiet, thoughts loosen their grip, and the present moment softens, as if it too remembers how to rest. Long before names were carved into stone, before measures of time were counted or ordered, there may have been nights like this. Still, patient, carrying the faint weight of memory without asking it to be explained. It is in such stillness that old stories seem to breathe again. Not loudly, not clearly, but as something felt rather than understood. There are moments when the past does not arrive as a sequence of events, but as an atmosphere. A sense of having been here before, or of having heard something long ago that was never fully grasped. Perhaps the earliest memories of humanity were not sharp images or precise lessons, but gentle impressions, shadows of guidance, warmth without words, direction without command. These impressions, if they lingered at all, may have done so quietly, folding themselves into ritual, into habit, into the unspoken ways people looked at the sky. Across long stretches of forgetting, fragments survived. Not intact stories, not instructions preserved whole, but pieces, phrases, symbols, gestures, remembered imperfectly yet carried with care. In some places, these fragments were pressed into clay, marked slowly by hands that worked with patience rather than certainty. The act itself may have been less about recording truth and more about holding on to a feeling that something important had once been said, or perhaps gently implied. It may be that those who shaped the tablets did not believe they were writing history as we imagine it now. Perhaps they were preserving echoes, a sense that guidance had once been given, not as law or command, but as presence. And that one day, that presence had withdrawn, not in anger, not in conquest, but in silence. The memory does not speak of thunder or collapse at first. It begins much earlier, in calm seasons, when the rivers still followed their familiar paths, and the sky was not yet heavy with promise of change. In those remembered days, teaching may not have been something delivered from above, but something absorbed slowly, as one absorbs the rhythm of breathing. Those remembered as teachers in these traditions are not described as rulers. They do not arrive with banners or weapons. They are not recalled as conquerors or judges. Instead, they linger at the edges of memory as figures who watched, who observed, who perhaps guided simply by being present. Their knowledge, if that word can even be used, may have been shared through closeness rather than instruction, through shared silence, through repeated gestures, through the patient demonstration of balance and restraint. It may be that people learned, not because they were told, but because they were allowed to see, how to read the shifting moods of water and sky, how to listen when the world seemed to speak softly, and how to wait when it did not. These lessons would not have needed explanation. They would have unfolded naturally, like understanding that comes after long familiarity, rather than sudden revelation. And yet, memory suggests that this presence did not remain forever. There is no clear moment of departure in these fragments, no single line that announces an ending. Instead, there is a gradual thinning, as if a voice once heard nearby began to sound farther away. Guidance became suggestion. Suggestion faded into ritual, and habit, over time, lost its origin, becoming something performed without knowing why. Those who pressed symbols into clay may have done so at the edge of this fading. Perhaps they sensed that something was withdrawing, not abandoning, but stepping back, and perhaps they feared that without some trace, even an imperfect one, the memory would dissolve completely. The tablets, as remembered, do not read like commands meant to last forever. They feel hesitant, fragment, as if the writers themselves were unsure of what they were preserving. Some symbols seem repeated, as though emphasis might compensate for uncertainty, suggesting not ignorance, but the difficulty of capturing something that was never meant to be fixed. It may be that the teacher remembered in these traditions did not wish to be recorded at all, that withdrawal itself was part of the lesson. To step away so that humanity would no longer rely on presence, but on memory, on internalized understanding rather than external guidance. Silence, in this sense, would not be absence, but trust. As seasons passed, subtle changes crept into the world. The rivers behaved differently. The ground remembered water in ways it had not before. Skies grew heavy, more often lingering with a weight that felt unfamiliar. These changes were not sudden, and so they were not immediately feared. They were noticed. It may be that during this time the remembered teacher offered no new instruction, or perhaps instruction was offered only through omission, by not intervening, by allowing people to face uncertainty on their own. If this is how it was remembered, then the farewell was not spoken in words, but in restraint. Those who later shaped the memory into story may have sensed this restraint as sadness, or as inevitability. Not a punishment, not a test, but a necessary step in the long unfolding of humanity. To learn, perhaps, one must eventually stand alone, even if the memory of guidance remains. The flood, when it appears in these traditions, does not arrive merely as destruction. It feels more like a boundary and a line between one way of remembering and another. Before it, memory was close, warm, almost tangible. After it, memory became distant, scattered, something to be reconstructed. It is whispered that the farewell came before the waters rose. Not announced, not dramatic, simply a recognition that the time of closeness had ended. The teacher, remembered dimly, did not warn or command. Perhaps there was only a look, a final shared silence, a sense that something familiar was receding beyond reach. Those who survived the waters carried what they could, not only in objects but in habits of thought. The way they told stories, the way they respected certain places, the way they approached knowledge with a mix of reverence and caution. These carried memories were not precise, but they endured over generations. It became myth, then tradition, then symbol. Names changed, Zos shifted. What was once remembered as a quiet withdrawal might later be spoken of as departure, or even exile. But beneath these later interpretations, a softer memory may still linger, that of a teacher who chose silence over control. The tablets, shaped long after the waters had settled, may reflect this layered remembering. They do not present a clear narrative, because the memory itself was no longer clear. What remained was tone, a sense of loss without bitterness, absence without anger, silence that felt intentional rather than imposed. Why they suggest rather than declare. They may have been written by those who understood that some things are not meant to be explained fully, only acknowledge that memory once broken cannot be restored whole, only approached gently. As the night deepens, it becomes easier to imagine how such memories might survive, not as facts to be proven, but as feelings carried quietly through time. A sense that humanity was once accompanied, and that one day that accompaniment faded, leaving behind a responsibility rather than a command. If there was a farewell, it was likely not meant to be remembered clearly. It may have been meant to dissolve, leaving behind only the shape of absence, and perhaps the greatest trace of that farewell is not found in symbols pressed into clay, but in the human tendency to look backward, to sense that something meaningful lies just beyond recall. The story, as it unfolds, does not seek resolution. It lingers, as memory does, moving slowly, allowing space for uncertainty. And in that uncertainty there is rest. A quiet understanding that not all guidance is meant to remain visible, and not all teachers are meant to stay. The silence that followed may not have been emptiness, but invitation, an opening into responsibility, into choice, into the long, uncertain path of remembering without certainty. And as the waters receded, and generations passed, that silence continued to whisper not instruction, not truths, but a gentle reminder that something had once been shared and that its echoes still lived. In the long quiet after survival, when the land slowly learned its new shapes and the rivers traced unfamiliar paths, People began again with what little certainty they possessed. They rebuilt not from knowledge, but from instinct. Guided by impressions that felt older than their own lives, fires were lit in familiar ways, though no one could say who had first shown them how. Fields were tended with gestures repeated faithfully, even when their origin had faded beyond recall. It may be that these acts were themselves the remnants of teaching lessons that had sunk so deeply they no longer needed explanation. Stories, when they were spoken, did not rush. They unfolded slowly, often circling back on themselves, as though repetition might steady something fragile. The teller would pause, searching for the right rhythm rather than the right words. Listeners did not interrupt. They sensed that what was being shared was not meant to be questioned sharply, only held gently, like something passed from hand to hand in the dark. In these stories, the figure of the teacher rarely stood at the center. Instead, there were spaces where a presence might have been. A pause where something should have been said, but wasn't. Children learned to listen to these pauses as carefully as they listened to the words. Perhaps it was understood that silence carried meaning too, and that some knowledge arrived only when nothing was spoken. As generation unfolded, memory softened further. What had once been closeness became reverence. Rituals grew more formal, their movements fixed even as their meanings grew distant. Yet even in this transformation, something gentle remained. The laws were not always harsh. They often carried restraint, as though echoing an older lesson about balance rather than dominance. It may be that this restraint was the true inheritance of the teacher's farewell, not a command to obey, but an example of how to withdraw without destruction. To step aside without erasing what had been shared in this way. Absence itself became instructive, teaching patience, humility, and the acceptance of uncertainty. Those who later pressed symbols into clay were living at a distance from the original memory. Their world was louder now, more crowded with rules and structures. Yet beneath it all lingered a sense of having arrived late to something important. The tablets they shaped did not attempt to reconstruct the past exactly. They felt more like offerings, attempts to honor what could no longer be fully remembered. When they wrote of floods, they did not always describe waves or rain. Sometimes the flood appeared as forgetting itself, as the overwhelming force that washes away clarity and leaves only fragments behind. In this telling, survival was not merely physical. It was the survival of memory, however incomplete. The farewell, if it was remembered at all, appeared not as a moment, but as a feeling threaded through these accounts. A sense of guidance receding just when it seemed most needed. Yet there was no accusation in this memory, no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance that growth might require solitude. Night after night, as people gathered under open skies, the stars became companions in this remembering. Their slow, reliable movements offered comfort. Perhaps they were watched once alongside the teacher. Their patterns pointed out not as secrets to be mastered, but as rhythms to be respected. Now, in the absence of that presence, the stars remained, steady and indifferent, inviting observation without promise. Children asked questions, as children always do. Where did we come from? Who showed us these things? The answers were rarely direct. Elders spoke instead of listening, of watching, of waiting. They told stories that circled around a presence without naming it, careful not to turn memory into certainty. It may be that naming was avoided deliberately. To name something is to claim it, to define its boundaries, and perhaps the teacher had withdrawn precisely to avoid being claimed, to allow humanity to move forward without leaning on a figure that could become fixed, misunderstood, or misused. Over time, some began to speak of the teacher as distant, even unreachable. Others imagined return, though always vaguely, without dates or promises. They were held side by side, as one might hold multiple dreams without insisting on a single interpretation. The tablets, when they mentioned departure, often did so indirectly. A line might describe a closing gate, a dimming light, a path left untrodden. Such images suggest transition. They hint that what withdrew did not vanish, but changed its relationship to the world. As centuries passed, these hints hardened into symbols. The closing gate became a boundary between ages. The dimming light became loss, yet if one listens carefully beneath these later layers, the earlier tone can still be felt. It is softer. Perhaps the farewell was never meant to be remembered as loss at all. Perhaps it was meant to be understood as trust, a belief that humanity could carry forward what had been shared, not perfectly but sufficiently, that mistakes would be made, but learning would continue, shaped by experience rather than instruction. In this light, the flood becomes less a punishment and more a turning point. A moment when the old way of closeness ended, making room for something more uncertain but also more independent. Survival demanded adaptation, creativity, and cooperation, qualities that might never have fully developed under constant guidance. The silence that followed the teacher's withdrawal may have been unsettling at first. People likely waited, listening for a voice that did not return. Over time, waiting gave way to action. Decisions were made without reassurance. Paths were chosen without approval. And in these choices, humanity began to define itself more clearly. It settled into the background, shaping values subtly. The respect for elders, the caution toward excess, the belief that knowledge carries responsibility. These may be echoes of a time when learning was shared quietly, face to face, without force. As night deepens, the story continues to unfold, not as a sequence of events, a lingering awareness that something gentle once stood close and then stepped away. That this stepping away was not abandonment, but part of a longer rhythm, one that stretches beyond individual lifetimes. Listening to this memory does not bring answers, it brings stillness, a sense that not all questions are meant to be resolved, and not all origins are meant to be traced clearly. Some are meant to remain just beyond reach, guiding not through certainty but through the humility of not knowing. And so the tablets rest in their silence, holding impressions rather than declarations. They invite reflection rather than belief. In their quiet presence, they mirror the teacher they may have remembered, not commanding attention, not demanding understanding, but offering space for thought, for rest, for the slow unfolding of memory in the dark. As time moved onward, memory did what it always does. She shifted, settling into shapes that felt familiar enough to trust. The earliest stories, once shared in murmured tones beneath open skies, were repeated in more structured ways. Certain phrases were favored, certain images returned again and again, not because they were fully understood, but because they felt anchored to something older, something steady beneath the changing surface of the world. In these retellings, the teacher became more distant, not in importance, but in clarity. No longer a presence remembered through shared silence, the figure began to take on symbolic weight. It stood for guidance without domination, for knowledge that did not insist on being obeyed. Yet even as symbolism grew, there remained a careful restraint. They did not glorify, they remained gentle, almost hesitant, as though those who told them feared that too much certainty would distort what little truth remained. Communities formed patterns around these remembered values. Leadership, when it emerged, often carried a sense of obligation rather than privilege. Those who guided others were expected to listen first, to speak sparingly, to withdraw when their presence became too heavy. It may be that this pattern echoed the original farewell, though no one could have said so directly. It lived instead in expectation, in quiet standards, passed without explanation. Rituals developed not as spectacles, before planting, before journeys, before decisions that felt heavy. People would stop, they would wait. Sometimes they would remain silent together for a long time, as if listening for something that might or might not arrive. The act of waiting itself seemed to matter more than any response. Perhaps this was how the farewell was honored, not through remembrance of departure, but through imitation of restraint. To pause rather than rush, to listen rather than declare, to step back when presence threatened to become control. The flood, now long past, remained present in these practices as a reminder of fragility. Water, once both life-giver and destroyer, was approached with respect, rivers were thanked, rain was watched carefully. Even abundance carried caution. There was an understanding carried quietly that balance could be lost, and that once lost it might not return in the same form. As writing became more common, the challenge of preserving memory grew sharper. Symbols fixed what had once been fluid. They offered endurance, But at a cost, nuance was difficult to capture. Silence, especially, resisted being pressed into clay. Those who wrote seemed aware of this. They left gaps. They allowed ambiguity. They trusted that future readers would sense what could not be stated. Some tablets spoke of instruction given long ago, but never quoted the instruction itself. Others described journeys without destinations, or preparations without outcomes. These incomplete accounts may not have been accidents. They may have reflected an understanding that the heart of the memory lay not in content, but in tone. New meanings were drawn from old symbols. The teacher, once remembered as a quiet presence, was sometimes imagined as more powerful, more distant, more divine. Yet even in these transformations, traces of the earlier restraint remained. The figure did not dominate the stories, it did not linger. It appeared briefly, then receded again, consistent in its withdrawal. It may be that this consistency mattered more than accuracy, that the essential memory was not about who the teacher was, but about how they left, without command, without threat. As societies grew more complex, the absence became more noticeable. People faced challenges that earlier generations had not known. Conflict. In such moments, the memory of a guiding presence could feel frustratingly incomplete. Some may have wished for clearer instruction, for intervention, for certainty. Yet the stories did not change to accommodate this desire. They did not suddenly offer solutions. Instead, they continued to suggest patience, reflection. If guidance had once been present and then withdrawn, perhaps it was because humanity needed to learn how to navigate complexity on its own. The farewell scene in this light was not an ending, but a beginning. A quiet handoff. The teacher stepped back, and humanity stepped forward, uncertain but capable. In the dark, when edges soften and thoughts slow, it becomes easier to accept ambiguity, to rest in not knowing. The story does not push toward resolution. It invites drifting, allowing memory and imagination to mingle, without forcing them into coherence. Not as lessons to be mastered, but as companions in the dark, comforting not because they explained the world, but because they acknowledged its mystery. The tablets in their stillness continue this companionship. They do not speak loudly, they wait. Their marks remain open to interpretation. They ask the reader to approach, with humility, to resist the urge to fill every gap. In doing so, they mirror the teacher they may remember. Present without asserting, absent without abandoning. A presence felt most strongly when one stops trying to grasp it. As the night deepens further, the idea of farewell softens. It feels like trust extended across time. A belief that humanity could carry forward not instructions, but values. Not certainty, but care. And so the memory continues, unfolding slowly, never complete, never entirely gone. It drifts through stories, through pauses, through the quiet spaces, through words fall away. It simply remains patient and distant, like a teacher who stepped back and allowed silence to do its work. As silence settled more deeply into the fabric of memory, it began to shape not only stories, but the way people related to the unseen. What could no longer be approached directly was treated with care. Questions were softened before being asked. Certainty was viewed with suspicion. There was a growing sense that the most important things were those that resisted being fully named. In quiet moments, individuals may have felt the absence more personally. A sense of having missed something essential, though they could not say what it was. It produced attentiveness. People listened more closely to one another, to the land, to the subtle changes in weather and mood, without a guiding presence to turn toward. Attention turned outward and inward at once. The remembered teacher, by not returning, may have taught the deepest lesson of all, that it can emerge from shared reflection, from patience, from the slow accumulation of experience. This lesson, unlike others, could not be spoken aloud. It had to be lived. As generations passed, even the idea of a farewell began to blur. Some stories spoke only of a time. Others described a gradual thickening of distance, as though the air itself had changed. Rarely was there anger in these accounts. More often there was longing mixed with acceptance. It may be that those who told these stories sensed that longing itself was part of the inheritance, a reminder that learning is never complete, that there is always something just beyond reach. In this sense, the absence of the teacher kept curiosity alive. It prevented complacency. It encouraged listening. The flood, remembered through layers of telling, came to symbolize more than water. It became the moment when memory was tested, when only what had truly taken root survived. Knowledge that depended on constant reinforcement may have washed away. What remained was what had been internalized: values, rhythms, attitudes toward the world, survivors, or those who remembered survivance. They did not claim mastery over nature. They spoke instead of coexistence. They approached creation with humility, aware of its power to nourish and to erase. The tablets that emerged in later times seem to reflect this humility. They do not boast. They do not promise control. Their language, where it can be sensed, feels tentative. It leaves room for doubt. It acknowledges limits. Perhaps the scribes understood that to preserve memory honestly, one must preserve its uncertainty, that to present the past as fixed would be to betray its living quality. And so they allowed contradictions to stand. They let stories overlap without resolution. The teacher in these layered memories becomes almost less a figure and more a principle, of stepping back when influence risks becoming dominance, of trusting others to grow in their own way. This principle may have shaped how people thought about leadership long after the original memory had faded. Leaders were expected to listen, to know when to speak, and when to fall silent, to understand that authority, if held too tightly, could do harm. Not all followed this path. There were times when power grew loud, when certainty hardened, when silence was feared. Yet even then, older stories lingered at the margins, reminding listeners that another way had once been modeled, that withdrawal could be an act of care. In moments of crisis, some may have turned back to these quiet memories, not seeking solutions, but grounding a way to slow the rush toward reaction. A reminder that endurance often comes from patience rather than force. As night listening deepens, these ideas settle naturally. They do not demand agreement. They simply offer companionship. The story does not ask to be believed. It asks to be felt. The farewell, imagined or remembered, remains unresolved. Was it a choice, a necessity, a natural progression? The stories do not say. Perhaps they cannot. Perhaps the uncertainty is intention. What matters is not the reason, but the result. Humanity were natty. In this way, silence became fertile. It allowed for diversity of thought, for adaptation, for creativity. It created space for new stories to emerge, each shaped by context, each carrying echoes of something older. The teacher, by withdrawing, may have allowed humanity to become its own teacher, not in mastery but in humility, not in certainty but in care. As the night stretches on, the story continues to breathe softly. It does not end. It does not conclude. It remains open, like the memory itself. Somewhere between forgetting and remembering, between presence and absence, the echo persists, not loud enough to command, not clear enough to define. And perhaps that is how it was meant to be carried, quietly, imperfectly, through time. A farewell not spoken aloud but felt in the way silence is honored, in the way questions are held, in the way night invites rest, without demarks that point beyond themselves. They do not close the story. They leave it open, trusting the listener to drift, to reflect, to let the memory unfold at its own pace. And in that drifting, the past does not press forward. It waits, patient and distant, like a teacher who once stood nearby and then stepped away, leaving behind not instructions, but space. As the night moves toward its quietest hours, the memory no longer feels like something distant. It settles gently, as though it has always been present, waiting for the mind to slow enough to notice. The story does not insist on being understood. It rests beside the listener, content to exist without resolution. If there was once a teacher remembered, through fragments of clay and silence, then perhaps their final gift was this very openness, A world not sealed by certainty, but left unfinished. A path not illuminated entirely, but visible just enough to invite careful steps. In stepping back, the presence allowed humanity to listen more deeply. To one another, to the land, to the subtle rhythms that continue without explanation. The flood, carried softly through memory, no longer feels like an ending. It feels like a veil, on one side, closeness and guidance. On the other, responsibility. Between them, a passage marked not by commands, but by trust. What survived was not instruction, but an attitude toward the world. Noon shaped by patience, restraint, and quiet attention. The tablets remain, not as answers, but as companions. Their remarks do not close meaning. They open it. It shifts, it breathes, it changes, as each generation listens in its own way. What matters is not accuracy but care. In the end, the farewell does not echo as loss. It lingers as space. Space to wonder without fear. Space to act without permission. Space to rest in the knowledge that guidance does not always speak, and that silence can still teach. As thoughts grow softer, the story fades naturally, like embers dimming without extinguishing. Nothing demands conclusion. Nothing insists on belief. The memory remains, quiet and distant, carried gently forward by those willing to listen.